Good evening, everyone. Please be seated. Okay, kia ora tātou, good evening, everybody. Ladies and gentlemen, councillors, local board members, colleagues, friends, newcomers, allies, army, members of the army. Welcome to this evening's Auckland Conversations, from roads to vehicles, from streets to people. My name is Ludo Campbell-Reid, and I am very proud to be the design champion for Auckland. I'm also the general manager for the newly formed Auckland Design Office, which is sort of a one-stop shop on urban design issues in Auckland. I'm also the very proud sponsor of the Auckland Conversations programme. I have been for some years ago, almost 10 years. I can't believe it, really. And I'm also your MC for tonight. I will be joined a little bit later on in the evening by a fantastic colleague of mine, John Mauro. John's a great guy. He's relatively new in the post of the new Chief Sustainability Officer role for the council. We're sort of really putting these issues on the agenda, and you need to appoint somebody at the right level and the right part of the organisation to get momentum on these things. So really will be thrilled to introduce him a little bit later. So on behalf of the Auckland Conversations team, Susan, Quinn and Jean and the team, want to welcome you all tonight. I also want to thank and take the opportunity to thank our partners, our programme partners, Jib and Rosine, without whose support and help and money and budget and support, we wouldn't be putting on these programmes. So I want to play a big thanks to them. So would you mind putting your hands together for Jib and Rosine? I also want to sort of, at this moment, just thank our programme sponsors as well, who are up on the screen, not behind me, well, actually, yeah, behind me and across from me. Again, these teams have helped us put on tonight's event in particular, as well as supporting the entire series. So it's really an incredible public sector PPP in many respects, and building again, an army of people supporting this agenda. So let's get talking. So look, before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping issues. As you know, the lavatories are out of this room and on the same floor. So if you need to go there, please do so. In the unlikely event of a, I don't know why that's funny, but maybe I'll use that again next time. But if you need to relieve yourself, please excuse yourself, and that's no problem. In the unlikely event of a fire or anything, there is an alarm system, and that will sound, and the team from the AOTS Centre team will escort people out. They'll have bright jackets on and so forth. So let's cross fingers on that. I just want to say, in terms of the agenda, what we'll do is we'll shortly be hearing from our two speakers. And then, as I said, I'll be joined by John for questions and answers at the end, and that's really where we want to get the conversation going. And we'll do our best to make sure that is an exciting and vibrant conversation. So tonight is a big night for the Auckland Conversations series. Not only do we have two incredible guys, talented guys, who are here to share their experience, their knowledge, their sort of wisdom and insights. But tonight we're really excited to launch something which is a new thing. I think it's one of the real firsts in the world, which is the Auckland Conversations media channel. It sounds, what that means is this is a project which is going live. We are live streaming now around the world for the first time, and it's just really an opportunity that we have a real deep level of information, a deep set of ideas, plans, conversations, which we just think needs to be shared more easily, more freely across Auckland, across New Zealand, but across the world. And I think there's an opportunity for this channel to really change the way, in particular, New Zealand talks about cities, but also about how the world talks about how we fix and how we plan and how we build resilient cities. So the opportunity, we've come a long way, as I said, since 2006. The first sessions of the Auckland Conversations used to be called the Mayoral Conversations. We'd have about 40 people turn up, and that was in the sort of bowels of the Auckland, there's a few people nodding, in the bowels of the Auckland Art Gallery. We now have moments where we have probably 80 people have come from all around the world to present at these since 2006. And over about 115,000, 120,000 people have listened and participated in attending through workshops and these sessions. So that is a huge amount of people who either go away inspired, trigger them to new thinking, frustrated, cross, whatever it is. It's about engagement and about conversation. So it's a really exciting time. And so these opportunities to take a new approach, take the conversation to the next level, take it global, and to start to join this conversation up all around the world. And I guess it's all about designing, conversing, and building a sense of ideas about, for us, creating the world's most livable city. And the presentations will all be on this channel, so you can go back and search on the old presentations, and there's a real extraordinarily powerful database of ideas. It's all there, it's just about us following it now. So the key thing about this information is it's free. It's about open sharing on social media, and I think that's something that perhaps as part of this conversation series, back in 2005, there was no such thing as Twitter. Few people had Facebook, but LinkedIn was only starting, and so there's been really a complete sea change, almost a revolution in communications around the world, and we want to take opportunities. We're a long way from the rest of the world, and we want to make sure that the world is listening to what we're saying. So tonight, as I said, for the first time, we're live streaming, so hi kids. I guess it's, there was a, I don't know whether it's come up on the slides, but there was a really great tweet this afternoon from Simon Wilson at Metro Magazine, just talking about, you know, this is an extraordinary level of information on a platform for Aucklanders to use, and who needs a magazine? It's much more than any magazine could ever tell, and it's interesting that we get that from Simon at Metro Magazine. So I guess let's talk about tonight, and I just want to, I guess, just to thank the team, Susan, for all their hard work. So on to the main event, which is why we're here this evening, not to listen to me, but I just want to say thank you to MR Cagney, Auckland Transport in particular, and Waterfront Auckland, as well as the Sustainable Business Network, who have all collaborated and helped us to put this evening's session on. So thanks, guys. Shakespeare once said, what is a city but its people? And I guess that's something that stuck with me for years and years and years, and that's what drives me. And I'm here in New Zealand, Maori, iwi, talk about what is the important thing. It's about people, it's about people, it's about people. He tangata, he tangata, he tangata. And so I guess then cities are all about people. And understand people, and then you understand how to build cities, how to build resilient, sustainable, livable, happy cities. So I guess I've thought, you know, maybe we should all be psychologists, not planners, because at the end of the day, understanding people is the secret to getting that right. And so tonight, with Jeff heading up the conversation here tonight, it's a very serendipitous moment for Jeff to be here. It's interesting at a time when we're talking about balancing the needs of roads, people, traffic, and so forth. It's a really useful moment. Auckland Transport have recently kicked off or kick-started the writing of a new street design manual, a section within their new, they're calling a transport design manual. My team are helping them put that together. So it's a really exciting moment, and that piece will then sit within the Auckland Design Manual, which is being built out of our team. So there's some really great work that's happening between the transport team, Auckland Transport, and the council, because we are now one. It's really around how those two pieces integrate. We've also made some great progress, and I guess you see the slides up on the screens, but you also experience the changing city. We've made some really good progress addressing many of the issues that we're going to be talking about tonight, perhaps in our smaller scale streets. And so the shared space program that you see across the city and the waterfront and across the region is really taking the city by storm. But we're also we're doing some great work within our residential streets, so such as Hobsonville and Long Bay. So it's really good work. The council is moving. We are undergoing a bit of a transformation in the way we do what we do. And the successes have not gone unnoticed. I was recently asked by Jeanette Sadiq Khan, who is the NACTO chair, who is preparing a new global street design guide, the first ever, to sit on their working group to help them prepare that. And the team from NACTO have asked Auckland Transport and Auckland Council to provide case studies for projects which we have delivered. And so you will see shared spaces appearing in a global street design guide. which is a great moment for Auckland Transport, for the waterfront team, and Auckland Design Officers and the Council. So our work has not gone unnoticed. And so I guess having Jeff here and the team here from around the world to come and help us move the thing to the next stage. So I'll do an introduction. Jeff is an expert in helping communities move from discord to agreement about the future of their places. For more than 20 years, he's been he's led award-winning plans in cities from Seattle and Vancouver to Moscow and Abu Dhabi. He helps balance modes of transportation in very complex places to achieve a community's wider goals and best utilizes their limited resources. He's developed transformative plans throughout the world that accommodate millions of square feet of growth with no net increase in motor vehicle traffic. And again, these are the issues which we're going to be grappling with going forward in Auckland. He's renowned for helping people define what they value and building consensus on really complex and controversial projects. He provides residents and stakeholders with the tools they need to evaluate their transportation investments in the context of achieving their longer-term goals. He understands that managing parking and transportation demand is a critical tool for revitalizing city centres and creating sustainable places. He's a dynamic guy and a frequent speaker. He's also the author of Sustainable Transportation Tools for Creating Healthy, Vibrant, Resilient Communities. And I guess there's such a strong link to what we're trying to achieve here, Jeff. He's the owner and the director of strategy at Nelson Nygaard Consulting Associates, a San Francisco-based transportation planning and engineering firm that really focuses on sustainable mobility. Just very quickly, Gabe Klein is also here tonight, and my colleague John is going to introduce Gabe to you, but a super combination of people to assist us in this conversation. So without further ado, Jeff, welcome.
Thank you. I've been, in your country for a total of 4 days now, and thanks to Darren Davis, my calendar has been very full lecturing on cycle design and transportation demand management and street design manuals, and I can't actually even remember what else. And in the course of one of those lectures, somebody pointed out to me as I was talking about international best practices, well, Jeff, you have to understand how special and unique we are here in Auckland. You have to understand that we love our cars here, and we love our single-family homes, and this is what makes us very special and unique, and you can't possibly understand what we're going through. Well, while I live in San Francisco now, I was born in Los Angeles. And while I've only been here for 4 days, I do think there are many qualities that make this place and all of you people unique and special and marvelous. But your love of the car and the unique qualities of your sprawl are not really very interesting or unique at all. And in fact, I think there's quite a lot that you can learn from the rest of the world in terms of the consequences of the path that you're on now and what it will mean if you don't change and if you don't change quickly. So as I mentioned, I was born in Los Angeles, and like all little boys growing up everywhere, I've been fascinated by transportation since I was a youngest, since my earliest childhood. And in this childhood growing up in Los Angeles in the 1970s, I watched a lot of television. And television taught me many things, including the fact that someday owning my own car would bring me freedom and power and autonomy and social status and perhaps someday sex. And so my country is very proud of its history of investing in infrastructure. In fact, when I was in high school, my first job was actually working at Disneyland. And one of the only rides at Disneyland that is unchanged since 1955 is the Autopia ride, which predated our interstate highway system. And people of all ages still love driving around these little miniature cars because of this promise, the incredible power of the promise of limitless mobility. And limitless mobility was something that was taught to us by the World's Fair Futurama exhibits. And I would really strongly encourage you to go to YouTube and search for World's Fair Futurama and look at the videos from the 1933, 39, and 64 World's Fairs that promised, particularly during the Great Depression in the United States, promised complete transformation of our society based upon limitless mobility translating into limitless social mobility and opportunity. And indeed, I would argue that there were few better investments that my country made than the interstate freeway system. And oh my goodness, our infrastructure really is bigger than your infrastructure. And it knit our country together in an extraordinary way, creating phenomenal economic transformation and indeed phenomenal personal transformation. But this gap between the promise of limitless mobility and its reality makes us as Americans deeply frustrated. And we get very confused and angry, and we demand that something must be done to solve our congestion problem. And surely adding just one more lane to that interchange will finally solve our congestion problem once and for all. There is no field in which we as Americans suffer greater cognitive dissonance or greater inability to think through the consequences of our actions than transport. And I urge you not to follow in our footsteps. And indeed, the problem arises because of the linearity of thinking in my industry. The thought that adding one more lane will solve our congestion problem and that's it, and nothing else will happen. But indeed, transport is a phenomenally complex system, right? And it requires systems thinking. Really, it requires thinking like an economist rather than thinking like a civil engineer. Because in our industry, it is full of feedback loops. Every action has cascading consequences. And if we don't think those through, if we don't build that thinking about cascading consequences into our decision-making tools, we will make very bad decisions, as we have indeed done in the United States. One of the other things that fascinates me about the conversation in the US right now is the relationship between transportation planning and public health. And I love it that the public health industry is finally stepping up and not only collecting data, but being very strong in the promotion of its data. And one of the data points that the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta has been collecting for a long time, since the 80s, is rates of adult obesity in my country. And so you see in the dark blue, 10 to 14% of adults clinically obese in 1985. Well, now, while we understand that correlation is not causation, as we watch the trends of obesity in the United States over time, and watch as we continually have to change the scale, because over a third of adults now are clinically obese in the lower Mississippi drainage in 2005, these trends continue and continue and continue, creating an astronomically expensive health crisis in the United States. One of the reasons why we can't actually have health care is because we couldn't possibly afford to take care of it. And there is no greater correlation between rates of obesity than rates of walking. And so when you build walking out of your communities, the result is, again, there are diet and other factors that come into play, but the closest correlation we've seen has to do with rates of walking. And in addition to this relationship between the health of our physical bodies and the role of transportation, we're increasingly observing relationships between our mental health and our social health and transportation. This is a neuropeptide. It's called oxytocin. Oxytocin is the biological basis of trust. It is the chemical that is released by your brain that allows you to believe that if you scratch somebody else's back, you'll get your own back scratched in turn at some point. Oxytocin is released under very specific circumstances. It is released most prominently in breastfeeding and orgasm, for obvious reasons. It is also released when we gaze longingly into the eyes of someone we love. But it is also released rather peculiarly in outdoor exercise. And we've all experienced this. having an argument with our spouse or our loved one, very angry, saying things that we regret. You go outside, you go for a run, you go outside, you go for a walk. And while there are other chemicals at play, including dopamine and endorphins, the release of oxytocin makes everything seem very different. And indeed, makes us not only capable of going back in and resolving that argument with our spouse, but over time allows us to trust each other, allows us to trust strangers. And so we find in the United States, Nate Silver, who used to write for the New York Times, wrote his famous heuristic that people vote Republican where there are no sidewalks. And so we also see the exact opposite occur when we're stuck in our cars. And the array of chemicals that our brain unleashes that are designed to help us when we're being chased by a saber-toothed tiger or in some sort of tribal warfare. All of the social information that our brain is designed to receive that allows us to navigate social space serves us very poorly when we're trapped in our car at 80 kilometers an hour. So you're driving on the motorway, somebody cuts you off. The brain signals two very powerful responses. One, threat to your safety. Two, threat to your social status. And so you immediately react. You may say something inappropriate that you would not say in another social context, and you expect a response from this other driver. This driver has no idea that he's cut you off. There is no response. Even if he wanted to respond, he couldn't. And so the threat level in your brain escalates now. How many of you have done something while behind the wheel that you would have never done under any other circumstance? Like actually threatening the safety of yourself and others on the roadway, right? This is your brain chemistry tricking you. This is your fight or flight instinct being triggered and serving you very poorly. And indeed, we find from the science that road rage is in fact a clinical term. Having these chemicals released in your brain regularly because you're stuck on the motorway commuting every day, those chemicals actually accumulate in your brain and create permanent changes that make you angrier, less trustful, and most importantly, less capable of thinking through the consequences of your actions. That is the primary brain response of the fight or flight instinct. Blood goes to the muscles and you react instantly, because if you're being chased by a saber-toothed tiger, you don't have time to think through the consequences of your actions. And so these two choices that we have of continually accommodating unlimited mobility at the expense of daily walking have profound implications, not only on our individual health and happiness, but on the health and happiness of society as a whole. So we wonder why we continue to not only allow, but to require by law developments like this in which every trip is required to be by a car. Even if you wanted to walk in a development like this, and there are sidewalks, it's going to be 10 kilometers to get to just about anything. And we still have requirements like this street. This is what our roadway design manuals, yours still here too, requires. This is what you mean by a complete street. And look, you've got, there's a mix of uses. There's some residential over here and some retail. There's a hotel. And you've met the minimum parking requirement because that is really important. And you've met the sort of landscape requirements, and there's sidewalks everywhere, and there's a crosswalk. This is perfect, walkable, mixed-use development. And look, there's even a pedestrian. This is the full realization of exactly what your land use code, what your street design manual, and what your transportation performance metrics require that your engineers do. It is not their fault that they are designing stuff like this. It's because your council requires them to. And so much of my work in the United States is pointing out to citizens and elected officials the direct contradiction between what their policy language says is desired and what their rules, regulations, design requirements, and transportation performance metrics say is necessary. So what do we do? Well, I think the first step is to recognize that transport serves no independent utility. Building roads, building trains, building bike paths serves no independent function. All we are in the business of doing is being an implementation strategy for achieving larger goals. And one of the most profound implications of any transport investment is really, we're in the business of changing land value. That is the biggest impact of what we do. And so the first place that you need to start when you think about transportation is to think like an economist, and to recognize that there is no more inefficient part of our economy than the transport sector. A typical private car is only used 5% of the time. And in that 5% of the time that it's only used at about 25% of capacity. We're not using 99% of the functional capacity of our personal mobility system. This is extraordinarily wasteful and ripe for disruption by the technology sector. The other thing that we tend to do is to think only in terms of infrastructure, right? Southwest Airlines is arguably the only economically successful airline in the United States, and it is economically successful for just two reasons. One, it provides good customer service, unlike certain airlines that I fly that shall not be named, because we're being recorded and I have to fly them home. No, actually, I'm flying Air New Zealand home, and they're fantastic. It's another airline. So Southwest Airlines is successful because they fill every single seat. They don't buy a new airplane every time they need additional capacity. You know, if one plane fills, they don't buy some more airplanes. They fill every seat. And so what Southwest Airlines does is the same thing that we do with every other sector of our society, whether it's food or clothing or housing for people. It is using the market to balance supply and demand. And so you'll know from high school economics that there's the supply curve that the more people are willing to pay for a good, the more the private sector will supply it, and the demand curve, which says that as the price increases for a good, the demand goes down. Well, in transport, unlike any other sector of our society, rather than using the free market to balance supply and demand, we force you to pay with your time rather than paying with your money, because we're Soviet communists in our industry, unlike other industries. We also ignore the larger economic factors of waste. So for a typical street, you'll see traffic volumes varying by time of day. It looks something like this, where you've got morning peak largely in one direction and then sort of the opposite at the other end of the day. And when you fixate on a level of service formula, if that's the capacity of your roadway, and you end up with level service F in the peak 1 hour calculated off of the peak 15 minutes, this is a crisis. Our transport system has failed because of that little blip right there. And we ignore the fact that all of the rest of the capacity of the roadway system is wasted. No other industry would ever think like this and ignore the waste of our mobility system. And instead, they would look at how could you spread that peak in order to take advantage of excess capacity that was used in the shoulders and also in the reverse direction. So related to thinking like an economist is making sure that we measure what matters. Typically, certainly in my country, a little bit less so in yours, there is one transportation performance metric that is held above all others, and that is intersection level of service. Intersection level of service measures the seconds of delay that a motor vehicle experiences as a result of congestion at an intersection during the peak 1 hour as calculated off of the peak 15 minutes of that hour. And it's judged very much according to a letter grade system from A to F, with the assumption being that F is complete failure. The intersection has failed. You, as the city traffic engineer, are a personal failure. You should be ashamed of yourself for letting that intersection go to F. The difference between each letter grade, is about 15 seconds. And it's also important to recognize that because level of service is a measure of vehicle delay, that if you're a person on board a 40-passenger bus, you are only valued at 1/40th the value of somebody driving alone in a car. Similarly, if you're on foot or on a bicycle, Sorry, you don't matter at all. In fact, it's perfectly appropriate to eliminate the pedestrian crossing or narrow the footpath or eliminate the bike facility in order to chase after the holy grail of good level of service. So this is what good level of service looks like, right? This is level of service A. Awesome, you've done a great job. There's no one driving in front of you. That is the highest thing that we aspire to in the transportation industry, is making sure you have unlimited horizons and for you to enjoy. Of course, this is a horrible, hideous street that is dragging down the property values adjacent to it. And this street, which happens to be the highest grossing retail street in Northern California, level service F. This is abject failure. The street used to be 4 travel lanes. The city reduced it down to 2. Nobody's suggesting that the street goes back to 4 lanes because it is so wildly successful. So how one thinks about level service, including level service for pedestrians, certainly you don't want that, because level service for pedestrians, according to the Highway Design Manual, means there's no one in front of you. The tumbleweeds are blowing past, the empty parking spaces, and you could walk really fast because the only other pedestrians out there are people who want to steal your purse. So how you think about level of service depends very much on your perspective. So if you're a traffic engineer, like, oh, crowded street, bad. But if you're an economist, you would realize that if level of service F means that the demand for the transportation facility equals its capacity at the peak 1 hour, in fact, you have sized that facility exactly correctly. That if you had sized it any bigger, you would be wasting money. You would be making it bigger than it needed to be and making sure that it was grossly oversized for the whole rest of the day. Moreover, as an economist, you might actually want to look at other factors that matter, like what are retail sales per square meter in the adjacent stores? What do property values look like? How much of a quality of life is the street achieving for the residents along it? Is it safe, right? So if we don't calculate anything other than intersection level of service, or if that's our primary criterion, we are going to design horrible streets that will fail your city and all of its larger goals. So I urge you to look very carefully at your transportation performance metrics and make sure that all of the values of your community are reflected in those metrics and quantifiable, because if they're not, those values will be ignored. In California, we have recently enacted legislation to make use of intersection level of service illegal in traffic analysis according to our state, the California Environmental Quality Act. And we're in the process right now of replacing intersection level of service with a much more sophisticated metric that focuses on regional average per capita vehicle kilometers traveled. So it's basically looking, rather than at accommodating endless driving by widening intersections in order to improve level of service, and thereby making it that much easier for everyone to drive and that much more difficult to walk or bike or take transit. In fact, we have argued that it is not new development in California that is causing our traffic congestion problem. It's the planned and required mitigations of that new development, which accommodate higher rates of expected driving than would actually occur, and therefore unleash induced demand and make it that much more difficult to walk and bike and take transit. So instead, we ask, what is the motor vehicle trip rate of this development and how far are people driving? And instead of mitigating that through widening intersections, we ask that the development move to a more transit-oriented location, or invest in transportation demand management, or invest in walking or biking or transit, the exact opposite of what we have done historically. Now, implementing these ideas requires smarter tools. George Box, who basically invented travel demand modeling, famously said, all models are wrong, but some models are useful. Never assume that just because it came out of a travel demand model, it is at all useful. Models are only useful insofar as you understand the assumptions that go into them, as well as their strengths and their weaknesses. Models are good at comparing alternatives against each other, but they are no better than tarot cards at predicting the future. Models are also notoriously bad at thinking like economists. And so none of us likes sitting in traffic congestion. It makes us very sad, and it makes us want to complain to our city traffic engineer to demand to widen the roadway. So we raise lots of money, and the road gets widened, and driving is faster, and this is great, because now, honey, we can drive across town to that fancy new restaurant that we wouldn't have gone to otherwise, or better yet, we can move to the bigger, cheaper house farther away and still get to our jobs in time. So the problem with faster driving is that it means more people drive, which makes driving slower and adds to congestion and makes us complain and demand that the roadway get widened, and that makes driving faster for about 5 minutes. And yet we still believe that surely just one more lane, I know it didn't work the other times, but this time, surely, adding one more traffic lane will finally once and for all solve our traffic congestion problem. I have not found an example yet where it has. The only things that solve your congestion problem are destroying your economy, as Detroit did, or making the market work with us, as London and Stockholm have done with congestion pricing. So in addition to looking at induced demand, we also need to recognize that any model that simply projects the future forward along a straight line is also going to be wrong. Modeling is like economics. There are no straight lines in modeling. It is all on a curve. And in fact, in the United States, like everywhere else in the world, we are seeing a complete collapse of vehicle kilometers traveled, particularly generationally. I am a part of the last generation that believed that owning my own car would bring me freedom, autonomy, social status, and sex. There is one thing that brings us those things today, and that thing is the only thing that I can't use while driving. And so increasingly younger people, while they're still driving, that relationship between personal identity and the car has been permanently broken. The car is just a tool. It is one tool of many. If it's the convenient tool, we'll use it. If not, there may be something better. And so this attitudinal change represents an extraordinary opportunity that we see in every single country in the world in order to tap into how our thinking about mobility has fundamentally changed. And if we provide better alternatives that are more pleasant, more convenient, more sociable, more dignified, people of all generations will take them in droves. But in order to do that, we need to do some other things. One thing that we absolutely must do is to put all of the needs of daily life within walking distance, and most importantly, to make that walk unrelentingly delightful. There is no excuse in Auckland, New Zealand, for the pedestrian experience on every single street to be unrelentingly delightful. You've demonstrated your ability to do this. I mean, the sort of shared streets interventions here in the CBD, the beautiful new residential streets in places like Hobsonville Point, the stuff that you're doing out in Wynyard Quarter, best in the world. And yet, Fanchel Road and out by the motorway and the weird, free left turn lanes. I mean, you have some of the crappiest streets that I've seen anywhere. And, when I look at what the future is of your economy, there's really no place in the world that matches your global brand value. It's extraordinary. I mean, everyone in the world knows New Zealand and knows what it represents. And if you want to remain economically competitive in this increasingly competitive global economy, you need to specialize in what you are best at. You are not conveniently located. Your sprawl is not better than anyone else's sprawl. You have extraordinary beauty of your countryside, and you have the opportunity for extraordinary beauty in your city, and you're almost there. You've shown that you know how to do it. You just now need to spread it everywhere. And you need to spread it everywhere not only so that the global world will continue to invest here, but I would argue more importantly that your best local talent will stay here or will come back here from wherever else in the world they have gone, to London or San Francisco or wherever, to be inspired and to work and whatever. You want to make sure that your best talent comes back here, and you know how to do that, and I would argue there is no more important economic investment than investing in radically fabulous walkability. Related to that, and in some ways more challengingly, is to invest in cycling. Given your distances and your low density, cycling absolutely has to be core for your economic development strategy here. One of the greatest challenges that you're going to face is that a quality that does make the city unique is the extraordinarily poor street connectivity. In almost all cases, there is only one street that connects each neighborhood to another neighborhood. And that one street is the most important street, in fact, the only street for every single mode of transportation. This makes investing in cycling uniquely challenging here because the cyclists are stuck on the same arterials that the cars and the buses are. And it means needing to take advantage of every square centimeter of your roadway and making sure that every square centimeter is delivering the best possible service in service of the quality of this place and the functionality of its transportation network. And that means assuming that your design cyclist is not a 28-year-old guy in Lycra, but this kid, or a 65-year-old woman with 2 sacks of groceries, right? It means focusing on not the 1% of your population that is currently cycling, but that 60% who are interested but wouldn't cycle on your streets as they currently stand, or on your bike paths that are wonderful but disconnected from each other. Cities all over the world, and including some cities that are starting out from a far worse place than yours, like New York, have been amazingly successful at doing relatively modest interventions in order to create dramatic increases in the rates of cycling, largely by targeting women, 8-year-old kids, and 65-year-old women as their design cyclists. Related to this, of course, is also work that you are already doing and doing a good job with, of making transit ubiquitous, making it fast, frequent, reliable, and most importantly, dignified. Again, one of the things that is amazing about this device is it allows us to be more productive on public transportation than ever before. It also allows us to be more sociable. And so one of the things that I love about French cities is they have recognized the importance of sociability as part of transit design criteria. This is a tram this is Strasbourg. You'll notice floor-to-ceiling windows. Transparent, you can see all the way through. You can actually feel like you're having an urban experience, part of the promenade on a French tram. But transit is not just about pleasure, it is really about geometry. The fact that we can cram about 10 times as many people per square meter of road space in a tram or on a bus than we can in a car means that as Auckland is as Auckland is growing, you have no choice but to invest in more space-efficient modes of transportation. And this is not because the car is bad, or there's a war on cars, or transit is somehow noble and good and green. It is simply because of the geometry of public transportation. If public transportation is caught up in the same congestion that cars are, your transportation network's ability to move people will decline rapidly over time, even as the demand for transportation grows. And so one of the most troubling arguments that we get into in the United States is the tricky situation of having a 4-lane street and needing to take away fully half of the capacity for cars in order to provide dedicated, congestion-free right-of-way for buses or trams. This is simply an issue of math. We can move 3 times as many people with that conversion, even if we're only moving half as many cars. A very difficult transition to make, but a critical one. Point number 7 is one that you were working on, and I'm so glad that you're doing this. You have to adopt the right street design manual in order for good street design to be the rule rather than the exception. Traditionally, or I should say conventionally in street design, most of the formulas of street design have been driven by rural highway research. The factors that make for a safer street on a rural highway are the exact opposite of the factors that make for a safer or better street in an urban context. In a rural highway where there's no pedestrians present, you kind of just need to pay attention to what's in front of you, and it's kind of boring, and you get distracted, and you may have spilled your coffee down here. And so having wider lanes and more sweeping turning radii accommodate driver error and produce better safety results. In an urban context where you're in a chaotic environment and stuff is coming at you from all sides, the opposite is true, that those wider dimensions actually facilitate inattentiveness, that anything in an urban context that makes it feel safer makes it in actuality more dangerous. In an urban context, we need motorists to pay attention, to be alert, and in fact, the perception of danger makes people pay attention and be alert and drive better. Fortunately, there's been a tremendous amount of good research done around the world. In North America, there's the North American Association of City Transportation Officials, which you are working with on the Global Street Design Manual. I would urge you to look at this as an example, but to recognize that your conditions here are a little bit different. In the US, we have the luxury of far more street right-of-way than you do. You're going to need to actually look not only to North America, but also to the Western European models to figure out down to the nearest centimeter exactly how to make compromises among all the different modes. We tend to still bloat things out and round things up to the nearest foot or two in the US. You don't have that luxury. Point number 9, one of my favorite topics, and also something that I know you all are struggling with here, is to get smarter about parking. There's a whole long, fun lecture about parking that I can do, but let me get to the most important point, which is our sort of conventional way of thinking about parking in the suburbs. So this is one of your horrible arterials out in the suburbs, many of which Darren took me on a tour of on Sunday. And you've got your different land uses, and each land use has its own parking lot because that's what's required by the law, and that's kind of what they want in the suburbs. And so imagine a sort of typical trip. You drive your daughter to school, and that requires a parking space. And then you go to work, and you park there. And then you've got to go drive your daughter to soccer practice, because of course you don't want her crossing the horrible arterial. And then you go and you do some shopping, and you park, and then you go and you pick your daughter up. And obviously, this is very compressed. But this is like what most people in the suburbs actually do in a compacted fashion. And not only is this a lot of driving, but it's a lot of turning movements off of the big, ugly arterial, which are exacerbating traffic congestion. So if instead you imagine building like you do here in the downtown or in a place like Hobsonville Point, where you have a grid of streets off of the arterial and you array your land uses high street fashion, and you put the parking in the back and you share that parking, then imagine the same trip. So you drive your daughter to school and you park, and now she can walk herself to school while you go to work, and she can get herself to soccer practice because it's just the little street that she has to cross. And you can run your errands during your lunch break, and you can meet your daughter, and off you go. This is the exact same trip as the previous one, but with dramatically different results. So it is half the parking area required because parking is shared. It is half the land area, or twice as much economic development per hectare as the previous one. A quarter of the arterial trips, a sixth of the arterial turning movements, and less than a quarter of the vehicle kilometers traveled, simply by thinking about parking differently. This isn't a transit trip. This is still a drive trip, but it's a park once and do 6 different things trip, which is exactly the magic of walkable urbanism. So, one final point that I will leave you with comes back to my earlier point, which is you have an extraordinary brand value here in New Zealand that you need to capitalize and need to recognize is your unique strength. The beauty of your country and the potential walkability and cyclability and quality of your community is what's going to set you apart and make you globally, economically competitive. But it also goes beyond that. I would argue that there is nothing more sustainable than maintaining what we already have. The most, LEED platinum, green, carbon neutral building performs environmentally worse than simply retrofitting your existing buildings and existing urban fabric to be more efficient. There's another fascinating factor of the human brain that I love, which is there is only one experience that we never tire of. Sense of smell, no. I mean, you have a beautiful smell, within 3 minutes, it's gone, your brain shuts it down. Even sex, like it's great, don't want to do it all day long. But beauty. Beauty is the one factor that the brain never tires of. How many sunsets have you seen in your life? And how amazed are you every single time you see one again? It is an awe-inspiring experience. And so I would argue that if your goal is sustainability, that there is nothing more sustainable than to continually make your city more and more beautiful and more loved. Because if you love your city, you will continue to maintain it, you will continue to invest in it, and you will outcompete every other city in the world where it really matters. So thank you very much. I've enjoyed my stay here in Auckland tremendously, and I look forward to some additional questions later.
Great. Thanks very much. Brilliant. That was fabulous. Well done. Thank you so much. It sounded like you were kind of going at the end, but you've got a bit more to do. So we're going to get you up here for some Q&A. There were so many parts to that. It was great, Jeff, and I guess there's lots of pieces we'll kind of come back to towards the end of the session. But thank you. That's brilliant. So John, I think you're going to come up and introduce Gabe. So John Mauro, everybody, is our Chief Sustainability Officer and a great guy.
And a great guy. Thanks, Ludo, with an introduction like that. A great guy. Ludo's the kind of guy you can actually say, Ludo, take a bunch of cigarette butts, a vacant lot, and a half-eaten hamburger and make it beautiful and sustainable. And Ludo will do that. It's pretty amazing. So thank you very much for joining us tonight for this ridiculously cool doubleheader. My name is John Mauro, Kia ora tatou. I'm Council's new Chief Sustainability Officer. I'm proud to work with a team of 8,000, 10,000. And yes, the Chief Sustainability Office is slightly smaller than that. That's Council. And to me, you can't do sustainability without an all-of-Council approach, and clearly without an all-of-community approach. And that's why our team's dedicated mission is simply to mainstream sustainability within and beyond Council. Auckland Council has done sustainability in the past. This is not new. We're building on the backs of some really great work. But with a new vantage point, a firmer mandate, and a dedicated team to coordinate and drive that strategic vision, sustainability will be part even more of our ethos as a council and as a community. And actually, it's really an indispensable companion for a growing Auckland and one that desires to be the world's most livable city. I also, just a quick commentary before I introduce Gabe. I believe sustainability needs a bit of a refresh, and so that the connection to people is compelling and irresistible. Sustainability, as I often say, is more than just getting your recycling right. It's about creating a vibrant and clean economy for people, planet, and profit. And it isn't just about getting marginally less bad, like less emissions or less carbon. It's actually about getting good. It's about revitalizing, it's about resilience, and it's about restoration of those natural ecosystems that sustain us, that we care about our economy that creates opportunity for everybody, and actually of that social fabric that binds us all together. I mean, look at this room. You guys are beautiful. This is social fabric in action. So, of course, this is all just what Jeff talked about. As we've heard, revitalizing and restoring really starts by working with people to make great spaces for people. So if you want to know more about our priorities in our office, you can look for our first Auckland Sustainability Quarterly. You could find us in your mailbox in our Auckland, I think in September, or you can follow us on Twitter. So shameless plug. We're at @SustainableAKL. So, aside from our priorities, you might wonder what a Chief Sustainability Officer does. At this moment, I introduce Gabe Klein. So I have this picture of Gabe in my head where he's sitting at this great cafe in a great city or at a great public place, having something to drink or eat and thinking about his next great idea. And delivered with this guy's about sustainability and innovation at speed. And maybe that's because that's the picture on your website. I don't know, perhaps. But I thought to introduce Gabe, I'll try something a little bit different. And just a pre-warning, he invented the organic food truck. So I want to do something around food, right? So I'm just going to introduce this like it's like a meal, and not to poke fun at the bio that I was given, but spices it up a bit. So a fine meal. Here we go. I've never done this before, but table for 400. The starter. Tonight we offer you one Gabe Klein, a renowned thought leader in urban mobility who pioneered both bike and car sharing schemes in the United States. Gabe's on the board of Streets Blog and NACTO, as we just saw, and recently joined Fontalis Partners. Gabe also advises a number of technology transportation startups, including Bridge and Ride Scout. Not a bad start. Another glass of Pinot and bring on that food truck. So the main course. In 2011, Gabe joined Mayor Rahm Emanuel's administration to run the Chicago Department of Transportation. While at CDOT, Gabe transformed the agency into a national model for innovation in transportation and tech. CDOT truly baked livability and sustainability into every project. And that is truly a delicious quote that I think I stole from your website. Gabe also served as regional vice president of Zipcar, the largest car-sharing company in the United States. He also served as the director of the District Department of Transportation in Washington, D.C. You sort of get the picture here that Gabe knows what he's talking about. You think you're nearly full, really sweet stuff starts coming out now. Can't leave without dessert. Not long after you leave this room, the world will welcome a brilliant new book into our midst called Startup City, Inspiring Private and Public Entrepreneurship, Getting Projects Done, and Having Fun. I mean, you want to read that, right? It's due in October, I think the 15th, and in chatting with Gabe earlier, it's going to be something you'll want to order while it's hot. Startup City is about affecting big directional change in cities fast. So tasty enough, but how about just one final morsel from this book description? And I quote, "This book is for anybody who wants to change the way we live in cities without waiting for the glacial pace of change in government." Now, I know he's referring to those bloody Yanks, but I can't wait to get hands on a copy of that book. So welcome Gabe to the midst.
Thank you. That was one of the best intros I've had. And I think I was left thinking, I don't know, this guy can't hold a job. Or maybe he's got severe ADD. Both are true. Anyway, I love coming to hear Jeff talk. It was sort of by accident that we wound up here at the same time. I was on my way to Australia for a family reunion because my wife's, she's half Australian, half British. And I was coming to the Sustainable Business Network today, which was an amazing event, and found out that Jeff was here. And we don't get to see each other too much in the States, but you know, we run into each other overseas at these conferences. But we had a great day today talking about how to affect big change, how the private sector could work with the public sector to really make change. And that's my mission, really. And I've spent the majority of my career in the private sector, but I was lucky enough to work in government, in two governments, and really take a private sector approach. So it's important that you know that when you hear me respond to Jeff, and I'm going to argue that everything that he said is, no, I'm just kidding. No, Jeff and I agree on quite a bit. I'm supposed to be responding to him. So I was rapidly typing. But, you know, I mean, well, so many things came to mind. For one thing, we came from a generation that really bought into this idea of working downtown, right, and living out in the suburbs. And Jeff had some great slides on that, this sort of suburban flight. Or some cities were really built that way. It depends on how old your city is, whether it's 200 or 300 years old, 400 years old, or whether it's 50 or 100 years old. And sprawl became an important part of our culture, unfortunately. So I was reading the newspaper preparing for my SBN speech this morning, and I read actually that one of the big concerns is the aging working population, which I found fascinating because I left my hotel. I'm staying at the Pullman something, and I walked out, and it's right by the Auckland University, and all I saw was young people everywhere. But that told me that you have a lot of young people here, they're going to school, then they graduate, what happens? Where do they go? And so, you know, Jeff also talked about economic competitiveness. And the fact is, if you don't build these livable, wonderful places that people want to be, the younger people are much smarter, and I see a few of you out there. I see people wearing hats and stuff, so I know that you're younger. I'm not talking about you. Okay. So they won't want to be here, and they will move. And something else that came up today, somebody brought up the fact that when you think of New Zealand, you don't think of urban spaces. You think of sprawling fields, right? You think of amazing meats and cheeses and all this stuff. Well, and I was thinking, when I was growing up, I thought of Australia and New Zealand sort of in the same breath, and I thought of the outback, you know, And I apologize. You had to listen to 3 Yanks tonight. And we probably are a little backwards on our thinking about your land here. But now when I think of Australia, all right, now I'm going to make a lot of enemies. I think of cities. I think of Sydney. I think of Melbourne. But when I think of New Zealand, I still think of the beautiful rolling hills. Now, that's not bad, but it's just a commentary about the urbanization here versus there. And I think walking around last night and today, there's so much potential. And Jeff touched on this as well. You have so much natural beauty that we would kill for in most of our cities in the US. You've made so much progress in public space, and you can see it. It's beautiful. It's the roadways that just don't fit. They just don't make sense. It's illogical, to be honest with you. And coming in from the outside, you get to see this. You get to see this incredible, beautiful place, and then there's cars whizzing by at 50 miles an hour, and you can't really enjoy it. So with that in mind, what I want to sort of start out by saying, I guess I already started out, there's a simple formula here, and I think just looking around, most people know what this formula is. It's not really hard. It's more mixed-use, dense development, eliminating travel as much as possible, unnecessary travel, and having everything within 5 minutes walk if possible. Your school, your doctor, your grocery store, all of the essentials that you need day to day. You also need a mesh of public and private transport options. And I live in Washington, D.C., and Washington, D.C. made a decision about 14 years ago under a new mayor to really overhaul the way business was done and be much more open to the private sector doing business. And we are now, I'd say along with San Francisco, the most innovative cities in the United States for the private sector to bring transportation options. So it's not just about the public sector. We need to then reallocate space away from single occupancy vehicles to active transportation. I actually wrote an article for the Atlantic, for City Lab it's called now, called Carrots and Sticks, about giving people better options. For instance, parking, right? We want to get rid of parking. It's the lowest use of public space, just from an economic standpoint, as Jeff was saying. So if we want to get rid of parking, we got to give people better options, right? And I'm not going to go into detail because I don't have time, but I encourage you to read that article because when you give people carrots, then it's much easier to give them the stick. If you try to just give them the stick and no carrot, there's going to be big backlash. And that's something that I learned in government. So basically, our challenge is not really knowing what to do. I think everybody knows what we need to do. I mean, we need to have these sessions. We need to remind ourselves what it is that we need to do. And Jeff did a wonderful job of that. But it's really about acting on it, right? It's about making the decision that we're going to go forward. And then really it's change management, which is a fancy sort of term for getting people to go along with you on your ride. And I think what was interesting for me going from the private sector into the public sector is that in the private sector, it's all about operations and marketing, right? You have to learn how to operationalize your new service, your new product, and then you need to market it to people to get them to buy into it. And that's what we do with Zipcar. You know, when I joined Zipcar, we had like 28 cars. And when I left, we had like 10,000 or 15,000 cars. And we sold people on the idea that you didn't need to own your own car. In fact, if you didn't, then you could afford to buy $100,000 more house or condo, and cities were getting expensive. So we have to make the change, and then we've got to sell it to people. And that's really what Coca-Cola does. I mean, look, Coca-Cola has been selling us sugar water for how many decades? And we keep drinking it. They're incredibly good at it, but we can't get people on a bicycle at Auckland University. I did not see one bike, not one. Now, I looked at pictures online from 1969 when everybody was riding bikes at your universities. So something's happened there. And I think we're not stepping up and marketing the change and putting the change on the ground as well. So the challenge is not only not knowing what to do, it's also not about moving people. So Jeff touched on this as well. We think transportation and great cities are about moving people. And I even talk about, hey, you know, the city is like a human body, right? And the bones are like the housing and the built environment. And then the blood is the transportation system. But the fact is that if we build the city in such a way that people don't need to move unnecessarily, then you don't really need this vast transportation system with all of these wide streets. I mean, you still need a transportation system, but you're moving people in a very different way. So it's really about health, economic growth, public safety, and as Jeff also talked about, it's about happiness, and then eliminating the unnecessary movements. And I'm going to come back to that at the end. Designing your streets so that the most vulnerable citizens are safe. Jeff also talked about that. It seems simple, but we have a very hard time doing it. But if you do design streets for children, now that I'm a father, I think about this a lot, elderly people and people with disabilities, then everybody else will be fine. And the NACTO design guidelines and the future global design guidelines, which I'm very excited about, that's what they do. So there is a roadmap already on a lot of different fronts, and you can follow it. I was really glad that Jeff talked about level of service F. This is one rare case where failure is a good thing, right? Congestion we think of as bad, and you're going to hear politicians talk about, we got to get rid of congestion, we got to deal with congestion. It's not true. Congestion is a good thing. It's the matter of what type of congestion you have. If you have people sitting in smog-filled traffic in their cars, that's not such a good thing. But go back and look at pictures, and I don't have slides with me, but go back and look at pictures of Auckland. I did. And look at how congested the streets were around the turn of the last century, or the 1920s and 30s. Super congested with people walking. There were people biking. There were streetcars everywhere. And the stores, there's people spilling out of the sidewalks because the stores are so busy. That's what we want. So thinking about that and level of service F, the automobile is one of the exclusions to this rule. But the faster people are going by your store, the less chance they're going to spend money in your store. And so when thinking about economic activity, the great slides Jeff put up about the work done in New York City and what happens when you put in a protected bike facility or you put in a great public space, guess what? Safety goes way up and business goes way up. Now, separately, those are two wonderful things, but there's absolutely a correlation there. As I've gotten older, like when I was young, I loved the grittiness of Washington, D.C. You know, some guy got shot around the corner. You know, it was like almost like a badge of honor, like, hey, this is a gritty city. I know it sounds horrible, but when you're 22, 23 years old, you think differently. As you get older, you want a safe city. You want to be able to raise a family. And we tend to think of public safety, at least in the States. You guys don't have the gun problem that we do. We have 32,000 deaths by gun and 32,000 deaths by automobile. It's crazy. Again, but a different culture, right? And you start to accept the things around you. So I sort of lost my train of thought. But as you get older, you want safety. And in the US at least, we think of public safety as making sure there's no murders, fewer crimes, violent crimes. Well, people getting run over by cars, 1.24 million people dying by automobile death is completely unacceptable worldwide. And we've got to basically change that. And one death is too many. And when Vision Zero started in Sweden, people were like, oh, you know, that's not realistic. We'll never do that in the United States. And now almost every major city has adopted Vision Zero. And with technology, I actually think we can get there. And Jeff and I will probably argue about this. Failure. Failure is a wonderful thing. And in government, I learned that nobody wants to fail. Failure is, you never want to step out of line and try something to the point that you might get in trouble, okay? And so for those of you that work in government, I encourage you to create a culture of failure because that's how you will ultimately succeed. And when you take the public with you on the ride and you set the expectation ahead of time, and actually my first meeting when I took over Washington DOT, coming from this organic food truck company, was with Jeanette Sadekhan, and we were talking about failure, and she's like, you have to pilot things and try things and be willing to make mistakes. And I'm like, that's what I do all day in the private sector. So I loved it. This was wonderful. But when I got to government, nobody wanted to do that. Nobody wanted to end up on the front page because they tried a bike lane and somebody got hit by a car or whatever they thought was going to happen. So in these government agencies, and I would say the same thing goes in big corporations, if you can set the tone as a manager that you are expecting them to fail, and then publicly set the tone that we're going to try this. We're going to try this public space innovation project. We're going to try this bike lane. We understand it may not work. We want your input. Suddenly you have this completely different environment where the public's participating in making something better. And in the projects we undertook in DC and Chicago, whether it was the large-scale bike share programs, the bike lanes, the new river walk, all of these things, we told the public we might screw it up. We need you to help us fix it before we spend the big money on the big implementation. I think in the interest of time, I'm going to try to cut this short because I could keep talking and talking. But I'll just say that you should understand that technological change is coming also. We don't need more capacity on our roads anywhere in the world. And I think Jeff did a great job of talking about this. Not only can you not build your way out of the problems that we create, but it's bad for your health. It's bad for your economy if you want to compete. It also looks like hell, and then you can't afford to maintain it if you're anything like we are in the United States. So be a fiscal conservative. That's my message. You know, if you are fiscally conservative and you do a true cost-benefit analysis of these projects, you will not build more capacity for cars, particularly when autonomous cars are coming and transportation as a service is the future. I mean, you guys have Uber here, right? There's a lot of other companies as well. They're just a part of the mix. But if we build high-quality transit, right, the backbone of our system, we accept these new business models and we shape them and allow them into the system, but make them what we want, not just what the private sector wants. And we take those excess lanes that we aren't going to need, and those parking garages that we aren't going to need, and all this stuff that we aren't going to need anymore, and we build active transportation and more density, right, to create places that people want to live, work, and play. Then we can use technology as a tool to create a much simpler life for ourselves. And that's really what my book is about how to get back to a simpler life, but use technology to do it versus technology being the focus. It's a means to an end. It's not the end. I think I'm going to end there. Thanks. Oh, the book. Yeah. I only have one copy, but it looks like this.
Let's give Gabe another round of applause, and also Jeff. And I'll ask folks to stick around just for at least another 10 more minutes, because we're going to get the two Yanks and the Brit up on the stage here. So please join us in a quick transition. And we'll quickly go to, if I could see through the lights, Q&A mode. And while you're thinking about your brilliant question that will be the first one ever live streamed at an Auckland Conversation event, actually, I'm going to kind of beat you to it. And I'm going to take the liberty to ask the first question as these guys figure out where they're going to seat. You guys got it sorted alphabetically? Great. So this isn't necessarily a setup, but maybe a little bit. Here we have two luminaries coming to New Zealand with a very similar message that they just sync together so well. And I think the more you dig into things, the more you realize any sort of problem or any sort of issue is quite complex. But just two words, gentlemen, and that is autonomous cars. And because I've heard very different perspectives, and I know at the core we all kind of agree somewhere about what right is, but it's very complex. And so can you kind of unpack what seems on the outside to be very divergent views on what autonomous cars are going to bring us as a society?
Why don't you start?
I can start.
Yeah.
So I would say it's all up to us. And the problem is that people feel helpless and hopeless, and the big companies are going to make the decisions, and we're just sort of stuck holding the bag. And if it'll make people feel better, and it should, NACTO is working on some policy around this, and we've been working for the last year, and I think it's really important, actually, because you have the Silicon Valley companies sort of doing their thing, right, creating these level 4 little pods that can be used as robo-taxis on campuses or within cities, and then you've got the auto companies that basically want to keep selling people cars but with autonomous features, right? And that scares planners. And so, you know, I think in terms of unpacking it, there are different points of view on how it will roll out. You know, Bill Ford, who I work with, Fontalis thinks it'll be very gradual and that we'll stitch it all together gradually, and I think he's right. Google thinks that we're just going to introduce the level 4 autonomous car, and it's just that's what it's going to be. We're not going to go through some iteration. That's also right. And Elon Musk just turned it on by downloading it to his customers if they bought the car after October. That's also right. So there's not one point of view. But if we shape it, when these companies come to us and they say, well, what should the policy be? And they try to shape it for us, we have to engage and we have to shape it with them so that we still prioritize transit, active transportation, dense living, and these vehicles can be a great last and first mile connector. That's my point of view.
Good pitch, good pitch. Jeff, what
Okay.
do you think?
So let me give a couple of responses. So I think absolutely, you're right that we will determine whether this is utopian or the nightmare scenario. But we need to start thinking now about regulation in order to point the private sector in the right direction. So on the upside, safety. 20 years from now, our grandchildren will ask, Grandpa, was it true that back in the olden days, they actually let humans drive cars? And you'll say, well, yeah, actually. And she'll say, well, but didn't a lot of people die? And you'll say, well, yes, in the United States, 40,000 people a year died, right? So safety, for sure. Secondly, parking. We have more parking now than we will ever need in world history, right? And so you need to start thinking now about making sure that any new parking that's built is adaptable into something else when the need for parking goes away, because it will be going away. It's already starting to go away as even the non-autonomous vehicles know how to park themselves kind of Tetris-like. So the other thing that happens, of course, is that roadways get a lot more efficient. So if they get more efficient, that expands their capacity, which gives us two choices. We can either reallocate that space to better cities, or we can cram more cars into our city. So imagine the scenario where right now, the only thing that holds back the induced demand equation is just how annoying congestion is. But if you no longer have to actually pay attention to driving, if your car is your office, or your bed, or your sort of your video room.
Now you're fantasizing now.
Well, I mean, it's very easy. Why wouldn't a 3 or an 8-hour commute be perfectly acceptable? The only thing that holds sprawl back at the moment is the annoyingness of the congestion that we're stuck in. Why not just sleep in your car? Why bother even going home at all? Or right? So, and then the nightmare scenario gets even worse if you imagine what the advertising industry would do. So now, you've got this car, and the car knows who you are, and it has all of your psychographic information, and you're captive. So why would you even have to pay for a car if the car was owned by the advertising industry that was just projecting, ads at you while you were there? Or why even stop at projecting the ads inside the car, when in fact the car could be just one giant blade, right?
But I'm gonna jump in.
Yeah.
Now, why is that a bad thing? I mean, because here's the thing. We'll need potentially 85% fewer cars. Now, I'm not saying that I want to watch ads, so I'd probably pay $2 and opt out of the ad, right? But I'm saying transportation as a service is the future, whether it's bike sharing or car sharing or robo-taxis or whatever you want to call them, right? And so advertising is, fortunately or unfortunately, a part of our culture. I did take some great pictures of advertising you guys have here. You use the public space where you frame the ads and you have messages. But anyway, I don't think that's so bad. I think we actually seem to like advertising. And I'm sure there'll be a way to opt out of it. But if it gets people to get rid of their cars,
Well, that is the good scenario, right? I mean, autonomous vehicles potentially completely destroy private auto ownership if they're regulated correctly. And right now, the economics of private auto ownership are primarily fixed costs, right? You buy the car, you insure the car, you buy parking for the car. That doesn't vary according to how much you use the car. Zipcar taught us that if you operationalize those costs, driving behavior changes dramatically. Even people who had a car and joined Zipcar produce far fewer vehicle kilometers traveled as a result of it, because they're smarter about their drive trip. That the individual trip is more expensive, but the cost per year is dramatically less, right? So the positive scenario around driverless cars is it's just something that you rent. And one of the first things that we'll implement, actually, is driverless transit, right? Bus rapid transit shouldn't have an operator, right? So that we can eliminate the marginal cost of improved frequency, right? You know, just like you know, driverless elevators were exceedingly controversial just 50 years ago, right? You know, there was an operator to an elevator, right? You know, people thought the world was going to end when those operators went away.
But you are correct. But Jeff is absolutely right about being cautious and fearful. Not fearful, that's not the right term, but being aware and educating people and ourselves on what's going on, because we saw what happened when the combustion engine was introduced and 30 million cars hit the road within 20 years, and then there were 30,000 deaths a year, and you know, it just went crazy from there. We killed our streetcars. So we are right to be very, very cautious.
So I'm going to jump in just briefly, because we could probably watch this all night, and I think those people who have been debating what about the autonomous car, you can now watch this feed and actually get the definitive answer. So I'm gonna say if Ludo has any perspectives on the urban kind of you know, land use component to autonomous cars, and then we'll probably move to our first question. I just couldn't help myself with that question. You could kind of tell.
We would go on all night.
It's a fascinating conversation, and I think this is something that we're going to grapple with. I'm fearful of driverless cars. I have a fear of technology. Perhaps maybe I'm a little bit old-fashioned. I grew up at a time when I typed out my master's thesis on paper and photocopied it. There was no such thing as computers and stuff. So I'm a little bit of a late starter. However, this seems to go against the whole point of what we're trying to do. And I love cities where high streets are the key, where the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker, it's all cheek by jowl. And it goes back to your service levels of F. It failed, but it's the best place. And I think I love to drive, but I come to work by ferry and I walk up Queen Street every day. That's my choice, but I still think my worry is this is becoming a Model T Ford version, because the car companies, they understand global, they understand sustainability. It's happening. I reckon this is a bit of a plan to make a whole bunch of new Model T Fords, the new version. So I think there's a value of it, but I can't see it happening in downtowns where you want vibrant, bustling streets, because I think that would be a really soulless place. That's my worry. And the other part of it is if you add enough driverless cars together, it becomes transit. So get on a tram and get on a streetcar. So a little bit old-fashioned, but I'm a little bit nervous about it, but I don't know much about it, so that's my view.
Great.
Walking is good.
You can say one more thing, Gabe.
Everything he said is right also. But so the thing is, we have a chance to shape this if all the cities come together and work together through NACTO and the future GACTO or whatever it's going to be called. So
Galacto.
Global. Gattaca.
I hope Jeanette doesn't watch this. She's going to be like, what are you talking about, GACTO? But here's the thing, right? You're absolutely right, and we don't want to get rid of the backbone of our transit system. But just imagine, let me paint you a picture of that downtown 6-lane street where you're able to get rid of, like you're able to take one lane and make it a tram lane, shared tram bus lane, another lane that's for autonomous HOV3+, a high occupancy vehicle, another 2-way bike facility, because we're going to have so few cars, so it can, and you can say when you come to our city limits, sorry, you can't drive downtown. I mean, they already do that in Europe, right?
That would be great.
But you can put your autonomous car into autonomous car mode, and if you have 2 or 3 more people in it, then we'll let you come downtown and not pay a toll. So that's the kind of thing from a policy standpoint that we need to do, because the land use work that you do, and the transit, I mean, it's absolutely key. We can't lose that.
Can I say one more thing, too?
These guys are making my job very difficult, and I apologize to every one of you.
If any of you thinks these ideas are new, another YouTube video to search for Disney Magic Highway. So everything that these companies are talking about right now have been being talked about since the 1930s and were beautifully animated in the 1950s by the Walt Disney Company. Disney Magic Highway.
That's great. So it's something like, I think the only thing that got picked up on Twitter from the conference that I introduced a panel to was that I said something about the internet was not made to look at cat videos. And it's kind of an unfortunate quote, actually. And sorry, news to some of you, right? So stop doing it right now and listen to me. I guess you're kind of coming to this place of reason where it's really not the technology and all the crazy. It's the people. It's the decisions we make from a policy perspective, and it's sort of us idiots in the driver's seat, really, in the big scheme. So let's keep those outcomes in mind. Let's make sure we know where we're going, where we're driving to.
Yeah.
Anyway, so I couldn't help but do that. How about a question in the back with a mic?
Thank you. I just wanted to make a quick comment, Ludo. I didn't say why would we have a magazine when we've got your website. The website, the online service is fabulous. We need magazines to keep you to account. And my question is, to both the speakers, I guess this is a room full of people who get it, who understand and agree with and are cheering on almost everything we've heard tonight. So the point that one of you made, it's not the what, but the how. And I'd like to hear from both of you, in your brief experience of being in Auckland, what are you hearing that we're not doing in terms of the how of making this better? What are the roadblocks? What are the things that we could be doing, could be getting the politicians to do? What are something mechanical, something that will open a door that will move us forward? Because we all need to feel we're moving forward faster than we are.
It's a silver bullet question, gentlemen. What is it?
That was sort of how I tried to structure my presentation. Okay, I've been in your country for 3 or 4 days now. So my observations are very limited. One of the things that's been clear as I've spoken to a lot of staff people in different organizations in different branches of government is that Kiwis are really well traveled. You guys have been all over the world and you're tied into a far richer global network than almost anyone that I work with in the United States is. You are aware of what's going on everywhere on the planet. You know about global best practices. This is an amazing strength. The trick then is actually learning the nitty-gritty details of the how. So the idea is there, and in many areas you've really implemented the idea. So in tactical urbanism, in low-impact design, in some of the public realm interventions, and to a certain degree in sort of new town development. But there's a lot of other things that I think are a real struggle here. So transportation performance metrics, absolutely. You really need to make sure that your values are truly reflected in how you measure success and what the role of transport is in delivering whatever the heck it is that you want to deliver. Street design, which you're working on, and which is going to be a real challenge. Your street design manual has to focus on resolving the most difficult tensions that have to be resolved in your city. And you've got some real challenges. Figuring out when it's time to get rid of the flush medians in order to reallocate that space to something else and what to do with that function. Your design manual has to speak directly to that. Figuring out how to make transit fast and reliable on narrow streets where you can't necessarily strip off the on-street parking. Most of the North American cities that I work with have that luxury. You don't have the right-of-way. So how do you get transit unstuck from congestion when there's not enough room to give it its own right-of-way? Your street design manual needs to really provide a fine level of guidance for that. Figuring out how to make deliveries work in a CBD environment while expanding the public realm. Your design manual needs to provide that guidance not for the ideal condition, but for the most challenging condition. Everything else that I spoke to as well, particularly on focusing on the demand side and making more efficient use out of your very, very limited street capacity. The fact that you have some of the poorest street connectivity of most cities in the world is going to be the fundamental challenge as you grow. You don't have another way to route the cars or the bikes or the buses. They're all stuck on the same road.
Yes, that's true. Everything. Jeff is more technically astute, I think, than I am. This is a behemoth of a well-written book. I would say, from my standpoint, having been more of a sort of a director, commissioner, I think you need courage. You need people in the right positions that are willing to make tough choices. What I've been hearing from people is, and I've been here less time. I got here last night, so bear with me. But like Jeff, I was amazed at how so many of your problems are like, it's the same problems we're having in Miami and Houston. I mean, it's the same stuff. You're halfway across the world, you have the same issues that we have. Maybe it's because we all speak English, I don't know. But I think that in very simple terms, it comes down to courage, action, measurable objectives. So in Chicago and DC, I put together 2-year action plans based on something that Jeanette did in New York City. And we would set forth 150 goals that we committed to hit publicly, and we were willing to humiliate ourselves if we couldn't meet those goals. So I think public, transparent humiliation is very effective in terms of moving a 4,000 or 5,000 person bureaucracy to make change. It's pretty meaningful, and hiring people that are not afraid to lose their jobs, whether it's your mayor. I worked for 2 mayors. Definitely one was not afraid to lose his job. One was willing to push it to the edge because people that are more concerned about legacy than longevity will push the envelope to make change. And then hiring people from different backgrounds, I think, is very important. So you don't need a transportation commissioner that's done it in 2 other cities. When I got offered a whole bunch of transport commissioner, state level jobs after I left Chicago, and I was like, you don't need me. You need somebody who did something else really interesting in your city, has a completely different background, that will learn a bit about transport, but really understands how to make change. And so I think that, and being willing to throw all the sacred cows out the window. For instance, we have people in the U.S. that love streetcars, or they love buses, or, bus rapid transit, or they love bicycles. It doesn't matter. It's like whatever's right for the context is the right thing. We can't be biased towards one mode or another mode, except for I do agree with being biased against single occupancy vehicles. It's so ridiculously inefficient and bad for us. But we have to be open-minded, and there's so many great roadmaps out there. So you just got to pick one, change it a bit for your context, and then it's really about executing it. And those pilots that Jeanette did in New York, I did in DC and Chicago, it's a great way to bring people along with you, show them, because we are, people are lemmings basically, and I don't mean that in a bad way, but people follow. They need to be shown because you are much more well-traveled than most people in the States, but still there are people who haven't seen some of this cutting-edge stuff. So go out there with some paint and do it and show people, and then get them on board, and then go take the $300 million you have for the cycling infrastructure, over 3 years? I mean, that's...
How can you spend that much money?
Look, in Chicago, do you know what my budget was? I get invited all over the world to speak about what we did in Chicago for cycling. My budget was 0. We had no money, nothing. And we did 100 miles of protected bike facilities and the largest bike share program in the United States. Where there's a will, there's a way. We had no budget. There's not more time to talk about it, but maybe you'll invite me back after the book comes out.
Ludo, what do you have to say about this?
Wow. Look, when this is a long journey, so there's a level of impatience. I understand that with Auckland, but we've been waiting 50 years for the right plan. We have that plan in place, and it's a 20-year plan. And the trouble is, every time we go out to deliver or accrue projects to deliver some of these things, there's a big conversation around budget every single time. So I spend a lot of time talking to communities. Sometimes the first thing people say, you're not going to talk about rates, are you? And us lifting our rates. So there's an important conversation that has to be delivered. And I think the issue is around not selling the vision strongly enough to understand that sometimes you've got to work hard and pay for these sorts of things. The other part, I love what you were just saying now. I mean, we had Mike Lydon here a few weeks ago. So Mike did, I think, about 150 meters of bike lanes down in Wynyard within half an hour just with some tape. So it's about doing the tactical stuff, but we've got some really amazing projects coming. And once those projects are delivered, Auckland will never, ever go back to how it used to be. But those projects didn't exist 4 years ago, 5 years ago. So the way in which we're working, and I think there's a level of frustration and a level of perhaps insecurity that this is the wrong plan. The plan is right. It's actually now about getting on and bloody doing it. The trouble is, it's going to take 10, 20, 30 years to do. And the trouble is, people haven't got the time or the patience, but they're going to have to. So we have to be quite tactical, short, hard stuff that happens quickly, work with the community. And I think that's one thing we haven't done as well as we could. The community have skills that are better in many cases than what we have within the organisation. Not always, but working together, and ask the community to do a lot more stuff than we do. It's not all about what the council's going to do, it's about what we're going to do together. And I think there's a bit more collaboration is required between the two, the public, because we serve the public. So it doesn't need a magazine to keep me accountable. We're working for you. Our best, we work our socks off, this council. So
that was a dare, by the way. I think that was a dare. And I think maybe Ludo's saying not necessarily giving you free license to go to the dairy, get some tape, and mark my route back to my house tonight so I could ride back safely. But if you do, there might be a beer in it for you. Hey, look, I think we have time for maybe one more question, and I've been ignoring this side of the room a little bit. So you've got a question in front. What do you have for the panel?
Hello, I speak as a member of the Seniors Advisory panel. I'm delighted that Gabe mentioned older workers. One I'm looking for is the fact that you made no reference to the fact that with aging population, you have to actually plan. So, the fact that mobility scooters might be an issue that you need to actually take account of. You had pedestrians, but you didn't have anybody with that, or with walkers, or anything like that. We are working on age-friendly city models, but I'd like to hear some thoughts about how you might accommodate that. Thank you.
So in addition to the market preference changes among younger adults being incredibly powerful for those of us who care about cities, there's actually nothing more powerful than older adults, in part because there are a lot of them, and they come out to vote, and they'll show up at your public workshops, right? It's something that I didn't really speak to other than in the cycling section of my presentation, but it's absolutely central to the work of anyone who's trying to manage a city, is paying attention to the full array of users and not designing for the 28-year-old white guys, but particularly for children and older adults. And that is for a lot of reasons. Firstly, it's the right thing to do. But secondly, particularly if we're designing for older adults, but especially older women. If we can design for older women, we've successfully designed for every other member of society. But more importantly, if older women or children are present, it signals to all of us that the space is safe and desirable, right? They are the perfect indicator species that we know if women or children are there, that this is good and it works. And I think you've succeeded in doing that extraordinarily well in the Wynyard Quarter by actually paying attention to children. We need to do the same level of effort paying attention to older adults, because if we succeed in developing spaces that attract them and are well used by older adults, it will work and attract everyone else. And that means involving them in the conversation and working with them to figure out what exactly is it that will make this space work for you.
Aware of time, do you guys want to add something to that?
Just real quick, I'll just say that Jeff's right on that. And also, at Zipcar, I learned a lot. We did a market segmentation analysis to try to figure out what were the demographics and psychographics that we were trying to appeal to. And we segmented the population into 6 different groups. And what we figured out was that this new millennial generation that we didn't think we understood, and the empty nester generation that we didn't think we understood. We thought we understood more the people in the middle. Well, it turns out that they wanted the same things. They were more alike than any of the other folks. So out of the 6 groups, the people that were 22 and the people that were 72 were the most alike. And what's interesting is the people in their 70s that were, their kids were gone, they wanted to get out of that suburban house, they wanted to move back to the condo downtown, they did not want to mow grass, they wanted a store in their building, they wanted a cafe down the block, they wanted a wide sidewalk for the cafe space, maybe they did have a mobility scooter. Well, guess what? The millennial wants the exact same thing, plus a bike lane. So I think often we think naturally, okay, this person wants this person wants this, this person wants this, and it's true, but then often there's a lot more commonality than we think. And so I think if we do design for the 70-year-old woman and on the mobility scooter, you'll be surprised that the millennial will probably be very happy with that.
Great. I'm going to let Ludo shut this thing down, but let's give our panel a round of applause.
Thanks, guys. That's great, man.
Not too often, it's not too often you get to see three luminaries on the same stage. So Ludo, what would you like to say?
Oh, nothing except to say thank you to everybody for being here tonight. Without you guys turning up, this doesn't happen. The conversation doesn't happen. I want to thank you guys, but I've never met you before, and it's just a privilege to have you here. I think we know the answers, don't we? I want to keep reinventing the wheel. It's quite clear. It is complicated. It does take time, but it does require dedicated, disciplined effort to change these things. So I think that's probably the biggest learning. I was scribbling down so many things that you both said, and I don't want to kind of repeat them because I think I'll just keep them for myself and the next presentation I give. But I think... I just think it was just great and a really cool moment where the two guys were here to help us with this conversation. It's also quite difficult for you, particularly Jeff. You know, you've been here 3 days working your socks off in amongst the team. And when we bring people over here, I think what's quite unique about the Auckland Conversations is that it's not just a presentation and then you go. You know, these guys are here for, well, in the case of Jeff and other people, here for 3-4 days, immersed in workshops with people. We're having dinner tonight. Dinner tonight isn't just about having a drink and a bite to eat. Of course, you need that. But it's about, unfortunately, it's about continuing the conversation with other people who are going to join us. And so we've got David Warburton, who's the CEO of Auckland Transport, joining us for a conversation tonight. Greg Edmonds from AT. This is about the new council working together as a team, because in the past, there was never a team. It was always a bunch of teams, all fighting each other quite competitively. So this is about building that momentum. So thank you for your efforts. It's a long way to come to New Zealand, and we thank you so much for everything you've done. So would you mind just thanking our guests? And last but not least, just thank you to our fantastic sponsors who make all these things possible. Their names are up on the board as always, but I can't say, we do this with a very small budget, not zero, but it's not too far off zero, Gabe. And we have about 15 events a year with hundreds of people turning up, and it's just because of the interest from the public that makes it valuable. So tonight's been a big night, a great night, and I feel quite inspired, a real shot in the arm. So thank you both, thank you everybody, and see you soon. Kia ora.